All right, my friends, we are live. It is Tuesday night. Actually, yeah, it is still Tuesday night. It's 11:30 p.m. We brought in Matthew Pose and James Larson, and tonight we are going to talk about the successes and the failures of Dolby Atmos as it relates to the home theater market. James Larson wrote this very controversial article because he seems like he's an Atmos hater. So we're going to get his points of why he thinks there's failures in Atmos. And Matt, as you know, you and I are lovers of Atmos.
That's
You
true.
don't have to convince us. We love Atmos. So James, you're the villain this time. You're going to state your case. We got some slides. We're going to go over the pros and cons or how you think there is some missteps and how we think there's actually some positive steps going forward with Atmos. So that's going to be our little debate tonight. And of course, we'll look at the comments over here. If anybody wants to give a comment to add in here, don't forget about our super chat feature so it stands out more and I see it. And I'll feature your comment here on this thread.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Okay.
So I do want to show you guys, last week we wrote this article. I'm going to share it real quick, and then we'll talk more about the slide presentation. In case anybody hasn't been catching up with what we've been doing in the last week or so, James wrote this article, Predictions of Dolby Atmos Success or Failure 5 years later. So we've literally been covering Atmos since it came to the home theater market. In fact, I started covering it with Hugo. You guys remember our pal Hugo. And we were trying to get as much.
They like Hugo better than us.
Yeah, they keep asking for Hugo.
I know.
Stop asking for Hugo. He's moved on. He's doing real estate now. He's actually making money. So congrats to Hugo. So anyways, when Atmos first came out, there wasn't a whole lot of info other than the bouncy house speakers. And you know, I've been kind of on a rampage on that for many years. And we'll be talking about that in the slide presentation. So let me go back here. And before I get into the slides, is there anything you guys want to add to this discussion?
No, I think I don't know, James, if you have anything you want to say first, but I think the slides actually cover what we want to say, right?
Yeah, let's just go with the slides.
All right, so let me share the screen and we will go over the slide stuff. And I'm going to hit slideshow from beginning.
Yeah, so this is the current state of Dolby Atmos. So much potential, so many successes, yet so many missed opportunities in object-oriented surround. And the intent of this is really to provide, I think, a balanced view on where Dolby Atmos really is at this point. So we've got James, who I think long has railed about some of the things that they've really not done right. And I actually agree with many of James's points, but of course they've done a lot of good too. And I think, ideally when set up correctly, it's great. So we can go on to the next slide.
And let's all be clear about this before we continue on, because I know you got to get some buckaroos that only watch the first 30 seconds of this video and they're going to make comments down below thinking that we hate Atmos. All three of us actually love Atmos if it's done correctly, if it's not a compromise in speakers and it's not a compromise in setup. I think we all could agree that Atmos is a great immersive experience.
It is, and research actually has shown, separate from everything we're talking about here, research has shown unequivocally that adding height channels can enhance our sense of spaciousness. Our perception, the accuracy of our perception of the space we're in is increased when we add height speakers. And there's just a ton of research that shows this. So there's no denying that it has benefits. The research has also shown that additional, hold on, I gotta move my computer real quick. Sorry, guys. All right. Research has also shown that additional rings of sound. So if you think about the main bass channels of our speakers, the front three, the side surrounds, and the rear surrounds is one ring. And then you think of the way something like RO3D works, where you have different layers. Those are rings of sound. If you add more of those rings, it also enhances the perception of the sound field. It makes it more accurate and more engaging. Now, RO3D and DTSX have actually been designed in a way that is more consistent with what research was going on around creating these highly immersive surround systems. Dolby chose a different route with the way that they've done their surround speakers. And I think it's for practical reasons. I actually don't know why they did what they did. And I don't know that it is any more practical than what RO3D did. But the point is, if you look at all the research and you look at all these university systems that were set up and how they're arranged, they look a lot more like the RO3D system and somewhat like the DTS-X system than they do like Dolby's.
Well, if I could say one thing that if I'm going to kind of put my Dolby hat on, if you look at before Atmos came out and they came out with ProLogic 2Z, that was like the biggest failure in terms of trying to get people into more speakers into a surround system. Nobody even knew about the ProLogic 2Z format. Now, granted, it wasn't a discrete format; it was derived height. The Z effect wasn't good enough for people to adopt, and I think people had a hard time putting height channels front and back wall. So that's why I think when Dolby said, we're going to come out with immersive sound, we have to make it easy for people to integrate. That's when they came up with the idea of, well, it's easier probably to put a speaker in the ceiling than it is to put them on a wall. And then that's when they came out with the Atmos bouncy house speaker, because they figured they could just put speakers on top of speakers and sell people an extra 4 speakers without having to do any retrofitting into their house, period.
And that makes a lot of sense, and that may explain it. So, going back to what we were just saying, though, I think all consumer-based systems are a compromise. If you compare what we have available to us, even in the best form, and you compare it to what's been researched, they don't really match. They make compromises, and they make compromises for practical reasons. Because again, if you look at the number of speakers, many of them have like 26 plus different speakers, and you look at the locations and how they're mounted to be able to achieve that, it's not something that somebody could do in their home very easily. There isn't enough research to really indicate how important overhead speakers, the height channels really are. So as I said, the research shows that it adds to our envelopment, but that research was actually focused on a different, they were examining things a little bit differently. So these were like specially made recordings that were designed specifically to test our perceptions of space. That's not quite the same thing as what we're getting out of movies. Research in the past has shown that with movies, our perceptions of our enjoyment of the movie, if you will, doesn't really differ between a 5.1 system and a 12.1 system. And I suspect the same is true when you add the height speakers, that it adds to our enjoyment, but how much is questionable, and it probably isn't as much as we might think. And so there's something to be said, which I think is where James comes from, of making sure you're getting the core 5.1 right before you start adding in the height channels, because if you kind of break all this up into percentages of benefit, the percentage of benefit you get out of the height channels may not be as much percentage of benefit you would get out of better speakers in the first place.
Right.
But to say all this, we have to remind everybody what you said earlier. We don't hate these object-based audio systems. We don't hate height speakers. We don't hate Dolby Atmos. We actually, at least you and I, really like these 3D immersive systems when done right. And James, I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, when they're done right, they're great. I guess what we'll get into is my main beef is that Dolby hasn't really set things up where a lot of people could do that correctly, and it comes at a cost in other areas where that makes everything worse, but rather than better. But we'll get to that. So
yeah, so
okay.
I think hopefully everybody that's listening to this knows what Dolby Atmos is, but I thought we got to cover the basics here. So what is Dolby Atmos? Well, it's an object-based multi-channel surround system, and it exists for cinema, it exists for home, it exists for headphones, computers, tablets, you name it. So it relies on existing Dolby encoding technology to allow backward compatibility. And so what this means is that there's sort of like a base set of channels that are encoded using their existing system, and then essentially metadata is added in to allow the system to then decode and place the sound in the different speakers, including those height channels.
So in other words, it lays over Dolby Digital Plus or True HD.
Yeah, basically there's some extra data added to provide sort of the steering and mixing, if you will, of sound. So one way to think of it is if you take an object and you place it in space, it has an X, Y, and a Z axis value. And the metadata tells the receiver or the processor where it is. And then from there, it can figure out how to balance across the number of speakers you have in the room and how they're set up. Did you want to add?
That's basically, it's just it's objects in a spatial coordinate system that that the processor automatically knows how loud to make it, where to place it in each speaker, obviously the processor would know how many speakers you have and everything. So it's like how, I guess for those who don't know, it's like how like games, like 3D games process sound in real time. Like if you're playing whatever the latest Call of Duty game or some racing game, it processes sounds exactly the same way. They're just like let's say a missile or a plane is flying next to you in some game. Well, the computer knows how loud that sound is, how loud it needs to be from each speaker, and those kind of values. So this is almost like Atmos and all these other formats or object-oriented formats are like how computer games have been processing sound for decades now, and it's like they're playing catch up, and like this is what should have been done probably quite a while ago, but at least we're finally here, and there's a lot more flexibility in the way that data is being like processed and presented.
Well, and part of the reason why it probably took this long was that to do this required a complete change in how movies are mixed in the first place. And that wasn't as simple as just saying, hey, we're going to do things differently. You needed to make new software, new mixing systems. You needed to train everybody on how to do that. So I think there was a real undertaking on Dolby's part to create the infrastructure needed to mix in object-based audio, but also then train everybody.
No doubt. I guess it took a company to do it like Dolby, but like I was just surprised it took so long to do, because like in a lot of ways it's more complex, but in other ways it's simpler.
Well, you know, they have to milk the licenses they already have and hardware and stuff. So that's, of course, they're going to hold back technology.
That
So
could have
let's
been part of it. We
so
can
what are
move
we
on,
on
yeah.
here now? What's
Well,
FOMO?
FOMO, the fear of missing out. I mean, it's this concept of having anxiety over the idea that there's something going on that you should be a part of, right? And I think in electronics, this is a huge issue. New stuff comes out and everybody's like, whatever this is, I want it. And if you've got the disposable income, you go for it. And you know, a lot of like Atmos has got really cheap. You can buy a couple $100 sound bars that will include it. So I think one of the problems with people being able to sit back and say, is it all it's cracked up to be, is that once you've invested the money, you know, once you've essentially had this FOMO moment, you've gone out and you've bought it, are you really going to stand back and say, well, that was a waste of money? I don't think anyone's going to do that. You're going to try to justify your purchases by saying this is the greatest improvement I've ever had. And it's probably very subconscious, I would think.
And we did publish another article recently about like the effects of expectation on your perception. So if you think there's going to be a big effect from some whatever it is, you know, on the sound, it could be a processor, it could be your cables, it could be the cable tips, or you know, anything like that. As long as you're expecting an effect, you could actually experience that effect whether that exists or not. And so if you're primed to think that whatever you're adding is the best thing since sliced bread into your system, then your experience is going to be different than very different than if you were expecting nothing. So like there's that, you know,
Well, cable companies have been thriving off of that for decades. And in fact, if you ever go to any of the trade shows and do listening demos, especially when the Audio EQ came out, the Audio EQ companies would precondition you before you listen to tell you what you're going to hear, to put that power suggestion into you. So when you turn this thing on and off, you all of a sudden everything opened up and sounded lovely when the EQ was engaged. So there's definitely a lot of that factors into
right,
perceived sound.
Well, and Gene, I don't know if you feel the same way. I know James and I have heard probably some of the best surround systems in existence. We've also heard some of the worst. And we've heard some of these really good and bad systems with and without Atmos. And I think both of us walked away feeling like the bad systems sound really bad and need to be improved. And the good systems sound really good. Atmos maybe adds something, but it seems like getting that core quality right is a much bigger deal.
Oh, there's no doubt about that. You got to get your basics right, especially the bass too. I mean, most people, you know, they put one subwoofer in the room, crank it up, and then they forget about it. But they don't think about balancing or doing multi-sub and getting even distributed bass for every seat.
Well, what we'll argue later is, I guess in a couple of slides from now, is that all this new like technology, the Atmos, it's coming at a cost of the core, the basics that you have to get right in the first place. So, but we'll get to that.
Yeah. So yeah, we can go on. So the success of Dolby Atmos. So Atmos sound mixes dominate the market right now. We know that major Hollywood movies are using Atmos mixes for theater releases by and large. All major AVRs, Blu-ray players, processors, many TVs, you name it, are all starting to include Atmos in them. I mean, it's ubiquitous at this point. Atmos compatible devices from companies like Amazon. So we know Amazon and Tidal are starting to include it in streaming services. Amazon included it in their little, whatever you want to call that speaker. I just want to make fun of that speaker endlessly because it kills me that this thing exists. It is beyond a bouncy house speaker.
It's just a horrible little thing. Yeah.
It probably sounds fine for what it is. It's just not surround sound.
Yeah.
So one major success for Atmos, and I maintain this since the day it came out, is before Atmos came out, DTS HD completely cornered the market on Blu-ray. Mm-hmm. I mean, almost every Blu-ray disc I've ever owned was DTS HD, including music ones. So Atmos or Dolby was first on the market to do an immersive surround format for consumer. And because they were first and DTS was playing catch up, they are the default standard, not only on HD Blu-ray or UHD Blu-ray, whatever you want to call it, but in all the next generation ATSC 3.0 broadcasts is all streaming now in Dolby Digital Plus with Atmos and eventually Dolby True HD with Atmos. So basically, by just releasing an immersive surround codec, Atmos basically has the entire market because Oro is really nothing. Oro is in Europe and that's it. Oro is a niche. I don't think it'll ever get any footing, at least domestically. I don't think it'll ever gain any footing here. DTS-X is a bit of a letdown in my opinion because we never really did get the scalability that they claimed, although DTS Pro is on the horizon. It always seems like now DTS, which used to be at the forefront, is now always playing catch up. And by the way, let me just take the opportunity to state that the DTS-X upmixer absolutely sucks for 2-channel music, and there's no way to fix it on current generation products. Meanwhile, Dolby Atmos upmixer sounds very good on 2-channel music if you turn center spread on and you don't collapse everything to the center channel. So I just want to throw that in there. For anyone that likes to listen to 2-channel music, you're going to much prefer the Dolby upmixer over the DTS-X one.
Right. So anyway, I think, we're making the point here. So there's no denying Dolby has done well with this. This has been a success for them in a lot of ways. And as you mentioned, the competition just isn't there. You know, RO has technical superiority in certain ways, but they don't have the content. They don't have the market share. It really doesn't matter that there's technical superiority because it's not there. So yeah, we can go on to the next slide though.
It's almost like a Sony Beta versus JVC VHS, you know.
I was thinking that too. Yeah. So, you know, here we have a picture of a over-the-top surround system. So Atmos owns the market, as we mentioned, for object-oriented sound mixes. But, you know, is it really the revolution in sound quality that we've all been waiting for? And this is the idea of, as I mentioned, a properly set up Atmos system sounds stupendous. Now, a properly set up surround system sounds stupendous as well. So the real argument here is, does adding Atmos really substantially improve things? And I think the answer is when budget allows and the room is able to support it, yeah, absolutely. But when you have what is more realistic for most people, a specified budget limit, Atmos is essentially pulling away from the core quality in order to allow for these additional channels. It's making everything more expensive, and it's not really adding anything of benefit.
And to elaborate on that, we saw this all the time when the first generation of Atmos receivers came out. Instead of having a 5 or 7 channel receiver, you now had a 9 or 11 channel receiver, the same size chassis, the same size power supply, weighed the same amount, the same size heatsink area, but they just crammed more amplifier channels into that product. And in many ways, it derated the product and it caused compromises to the product. If you notice, a lot of Atmos receivers, they run really hot. They don't properly vent. So they have to put big fans in there, or you have to have more ventilation. And then they go and lie about the power. So instead of rating at least 2 channels driven, they started rating 1 channel driven at 10%, 6 ohms on Tuesday if it was driven by a magic 6 ohm load. And it's like, all they kept doing, it was trying to throw more stickers on these receivers to try to call more attention to what you're getting. But in reality, if you look at $1,000 receiver today versus $1,000 receiver 20 years ago, the power supply is no bigger. In fact, it's usually smaller. And now you're paying a licensing fee to put Atmos on it. And I argue that if you're spending only $500 to $1,000 on a receiver, in most cases, you're probably better off not having the Atmos in it if that was even an option. But it's not an option anymore because now you get $300 receivers that have Atmos.
Yeah, and I see in our comments, so I just want to mention this, that somebody's bringing out the point that Atmos isn't associated with quality per se. That's right. Atmos in and of itself has nothing to do with quality. It's an unintended consequence of pushing a system on the market that requires the purchase of additional speakers and for receivers to have additional amplifier channels. And so what's happening is that because receivers, their price point can't increase, but they now have to have more expensive components added to them. So when you go from 5 channels to 7 channels to 13 plus channels, and you don't change the price of the product has to get worse in quality to allow for that.
Usually.
And adding to that some other problems, like in order to pack 13 channels of amplification into something that previously had 5 or 7 channels of amplification means they're much closer together. So you've got heat problems, and the power supplies haven't changed. So the power goes down. So even though they're rated the same, once you get into these, it's never going to be all channels driven per se, but actual, let's say, real movie experiences where the big dynamics are going on, you're drawing so much more power, even for those height channels, that you're losing quite a bit of power to those main channels. And you, Gene, actually had measured receivers and found that they weren't even coming close to their rated specs, which was because the manufacturers were trying to hide the fact that all of this was lowering their power output capabilities.
Yeah.
And then the speaker problem is that, again, you add more speakers, there's more cost. You can't sell the same quality speaker for less money just because people need more of them. So when you go from, as I said, for most people, 5 main speakers and a couple of subs is good enough. That offers great quality. And going to 7, for instance, adding rear surrounds doesn't really add a lot of benefit. So then you add in the height channels, right? That's a lot of extra cost. And so if you take your core budget to then afford those height speakers, is pulling away from the quality of those main speakers in your system because your budget is fixed. So,
and this is especially true with home theater in a box systems because, maybe 10 years ago, a decent home theater in a box system was 5.1 for $900.
Yeah.
Now that same $900 is buying you a 5.1.4 system with, like you said, inferior speakers, and that's where the bouncy house speakers start coming in. And you look at
they're really bad too. They're like little 4-range drivers.
Yeah, 3 or 4-inch paper whizzer cone drivers pointing up at this at God basically, and hoping that it does a good effect for people.
Hope all you want that they'll have a good effect. It's not going to happen. We've heard it. It doesn't work for good reasons. I mean, but I going back to like I said earlier about if you expect things to sound a different way, they will, right? It's like this is almost like it's more about the power of suggestion. These little speakers like giving you a height, because you don't really have a good sense of vertical localization, and not as good as your horizontal localization anyway. So if you kind of sort of think something's there, right, you're going to hear it, and it's gonna be there whether it's actually there or not. But if you don't know what to expect it, I'm sure you would have a very different experience. These things are just they're almost as bad as cables.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying.
Or like magic cables that are supposed to make your system sound better. It's like that. It's the power of suggestion. It's not really working.
Yeah.
Well, and I think Dolby made a big mistake thinking that they could become a speaker company, because that's what it seemed like their intent was when they came out with the Atmos enabled speaker, was they wanted you to license their crossover because it had a built-in head related transfer function, which we know through research you don't need to put into the speaker because our own ears already have that. It's different if you're doing headphones, but when you're listening to a speaker in a room, you don't need to go and make that crossover so complex. And even if you are going to do any type of shaping to the directivity of that speaker, you're either going to do it with a waveguide or you're going to do it in the digital domain where you have much better control over it than you do in the analog domain with passive crossovers.
Realistically, that should have been done in the digital domain. I never understood why they required this complex and expensive crossover.
Well, I told you why, because they wanted to
No.
license it. They wanted to become the next THX.
I know what you're saying, but they could have licensed it in the receiver instead. But to the point, yeah, and we've tested out these ceiling speakers, these ceiling reflected speakers in different forms before. The better ones are okay in the right room. They're not great. They're definitely not as good as actual discrete in the ceiling. The bad ones are just, they don't work, basically.
Well, and the ones that are better usually have to be above ear height, or you still localize them, because it's not like a laser pointer. It's still scattering the sound. Even as much as you try to control that dispersion of sound, it's still scattering the sound. And if you're too close to one, they're very easily localized.
You're right. And actually, when James came over one time when I was testing one of the sound bars that we were working on before that had Atmos in it, I made him sit on the floor so he could get the effect. I'm like, you got to sit on the floor. It doesn't work when you sit in the chair.
Even then, I don't think it
didn't work that well, but it worked better when you sat on the floor than it did.
So the main theme of what we were just talking about, and what I'm scared about, is when you deal with, back to this point, if you're dealing with budget Atmos, we're talking about, a $500 receiver or an $800 home theater in a box or soundbar system that has Atmos in it. To me, it liquidates the brand of Atmos. And if that's the only experience someone has about Dolby Atmos, they're not going to be overwhelmed by it. And in fact, to me, it just cheapens the brand. I think the Atmos should be reserved for, the better systems, when you have your bass channels all worked out, you have your speaker positions all worked out, and you have good quality equipment. But the flip side of that coin is you have to put Atmos all the way down to the bottom, because you sell mass quantities of the bottom, and it's all about branding. But I'm kind of a mixed bag about that, because do you want massive branding and all branding is good? Or do you want selective branding with good experience, kind of like what THX used to do? You couldn't put THX on everything when it first came out. THX actually meant something when it came out, and then they liquidated the brand, and they started putting THX certifications on doors and breakfast cereal.
Yeah, I love that THX breakfast cereal. It's hearty and
yeah, extra fiber. So that's really the crux of this: is are you liquidating the brand by bringing it down to the Walmart level or the Sam's Club level?
I think that's a really important point. And I see a lot of people, again, maybe thinking that we're bashing on Atmos. We're not. It's what's happened with it. It's that it had a lot of potential. It still has a lot of potential. And when done right, it is really good. It's just that it's getting done wrong a whole lot more than it's getting done right. And it's ruining what it's supposed to be. Now, James, I think this is really a point you want to make about the improvements you get out of using Atmos. So do you want to actually do this?
Sure. So like we said before, your hearing, it's more geared to things like it's just not geared as well to things that happen directly above you. And Gene, you talked to that guy. Remember that live stream chat you had with that guy in Germany who was touting RO?
Yes.
I mean, he made that point. Like you hear things that are kind of like more on a vertical plane than on a, no, more on a horizontal plane than a vertical plane, right? And so why are we approaching all this from why are we putting speakers above us, right? Like the RO and DTS placements made so much more sense, right? And so, and for that reason, the effect you're going to get, the improvements you're going to get, it's just not, it's not going to be as good. But as we said, there's a big cost. It costs a lot more. There's and it's a lot more complex to set up, right? And if you don't set it up right, it's going to make things worse than if you hadn't had it in the first place. So like, what are the points that I want to go over? Yeah. So even if you set it up right, okay, this is subjective, right? I'm going to say.
Apparently we froze. Keep going.
Okay, I'm gonna say that that how do I want to say this? Yeah. I'm thinking of how to phrase this in a tactful way, right? In a diplomatic way. But like, okay, so this is like I said, it's subjective, but I don't think that things that happen right above you, it's like, are that much more immersive, right? I've heard good Atmos systems, right? And it's not like, oh, this is a whole new level of immersion, you know? Now this is so much more convincing than what we had before. It's a little bit better, you know. I've heard it, and that this is all, of course, just my opinion, but it's a whole lot more complexity and cost for not a lot of return, you know. And so like we're really getting as far as surround sound like effects and our surround sound stage goes, we're getting into a very diminishing return for the cost that you're putting in, you know. And that's like that's kind of one complaint I have, you know. And that's like, and the problem is these systems that incorporate Atmos, like 90% of them are doing so at the expense of things that matter, like we just discussed, you know. So like it on the whole, as I see it, I think Atmos might have made sound worse, right? For more people's experiences, right? And not okay for the 10% of us who are like, you know, hardcore home theater connoisseurs, right? We're like our home theater enthusiasts. We can take the time to set things up right. We're willing to allocate the funds to make sure like you know, for the right gear to make things, you know, to create a real difference in a good direction. But how many people do that? Most people get an Atmos system or buying it as a home theater in a box, as you said, or a sound bar or something like that. And even those who don't, who buy separates, are they willing to take all the time to install all this stuff where they need to go? You know, there's the like the Atmos home installation guide with all these like you know, technical charts and how many people have like the knowledge to seek those out and install everything correctly, right? It's I guess I'm kind of getting ahead of our slideshow here, but like
Well, I do think that the people that are watching right now, there's some serious hardcore home theater enthusiasts. That
no,
work
yeah, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Here's
We're a small minority in comparison.
I know, and we have a slide. We have a slide. I think that you can go to the next slide. Basically, I think that kind of just that discusses this. Well, I mean, I guess it's a couple slides ahead, but we're not talking. So our audience, the people who we're talking to right now, they're going to be probably more well informed than the average person going to Best Buy looking for an Atmos system. So, like for the people watching us, if you found our channel, probably you know that, you kind of know what you're doing, or you're probably better informed than the average consumer electronics buyer looking for these newfangled sound systems. So like I'm not dissing your system. Atmos, when done right, can be an improvement over a standard surround sound system, right? And but mostly that's not how it is. So that's kind of my complaint. And here's a slide that shows the bouncy house speaker. That it makes things worse. It doesn't improve things, right, in a lot of cases, and sometimes it works. But like I kind of ranted enough. I'll hand this back to Matt.
Yeah, well, I mean, so in this slide, one of the points I was trying to make was that, and I've read some of these studies and they're so disappointing. They go around, they ask consumers, it's like James had said, like 1% of the people that answer these surveys are us watching this video right now. The other 99% who fill that out will answer questions that basically tell us things like they don't even bother to set it up. So like one of the questions they asked them was, do you go in and do the auto setup, place the microphone in your listening position, push a button and let it do its own thing? And the vast majority, I think it was 65 or 75% of the people who answered the survey said, nope, never done that. And then they said to them, do you do the EQ? It's, one more setup, again, automatic, just place the mic where it's supposed to go. No, don't do that. How about Atmos? Do you put the speakers in the ceiling? No. Did you hook up your bouncy house speakers? No. Okay, so you have an Atmos system, you're not even using it. No. I mean, again, they don't ask it like that because who would say that? But the point is that's what came out of these surveys, that the vast majority of consumers are buying this equipment, they're not even using it. And I think that's pretty problematic.
Well, just to give personal experiences, anytime I would go to a neighbor's house or a family member's house and they'd have a so-called surround system, even if it was a Bose system, which should be pretty much plug and play, they almost never had the surround speakers turned on. Or if they did have them turned on, they didn't have a digital connection between their receiver and their TV. So they only had analog connections, and they were getting 2-channel upmix with Dolby. So imagine now if you add 2 or 4 more speakers, how much more complex that can be. So
Yeah,
that is,
like you said in a past article, Gene. I mean, I think either you or another writer that we published, how many people could really set up a 5.1 system right? You
yeah,
know? Okay, and then on top of that, well, what should come next, right? Let's say you got your 5.1 set up correctly. Well, what we would argue, and we have always argued in the past, get more subs, right? Get that low frequency really even and smooth, right? So get a 5.2 system. 2 is technically not, a separate channel, but by that I mean 2 subs, right? Or
yep.
more, right? And so like do that, or there's and that'll make a bigger difference in my opinion than putting speakers in the ceiling. That's my
Yeah, getting the core right.
yeah.
And that's the point of this slide, which was really, Atmos in and of itself, there's nothing wrong with it. It's actually, I think it's a great technology and it was a great idea. The problem was that its implementation was forcing people to make decisions, putting their money in the wrong places and systems. And it was so they were spreading it out across more speakers instead of buying better speakers. They were, receiver manufacturers were being forced to essentially put in, as we said earlier, more components but sell it for the same price, which meant that the quality of those components had to come down. The amps became less powerful. The power supplies didn't change, even though more channels were pulling off of it. And all of that has essentially caused us to be distracted from what matters most. So somebody else had said in the comments exactly what our key point really is. Get the core 5.1 right, then worry about the rest.
And unfortunately, if you go out and shop a receiver today, you're forced to get an Atmos receiver. So what I would tell people is, at the very minimum, if you're buying a receiver, try to get one with preamp outputs on it. And I know that's not perfect because as I've already mentioned in other videos, most of the receivers with preamp outputs, the cheaper ones, they'll clip, right at around 2 volts RMS because they still have the power amp section connected to them, even though you're not using it. And that's something I'm trying to work with the companies to offer a preamp mode that disconnects it so that when the amplifier is not being used, it won't clip and feed back that distortion into the preamp section. But I don't want to get off too far topic. The bottom line is, if you have preamp outputs on your budget receiver, at least gives you a fighting chance to add more power as your system grows. So you can go out, because amplifier power is at its cheapest it's ever been now. You can get good 5 or 7 channel amplifiers online for around $1,500 now, which was unheard of a decade or so ago. So at least get a receiver that has preamp outputs, because you're not getting great amplifier sections in $1,000 receivers anymore. You're getting mediocre or decent amplification, nothing that could drive 4-ohm loads now. So if you have speakers that are more power demanding, you definitely want to add external amplification. And I would do that before I go and throw speakers in the ceiling. I would get like you said, get my core all established, get good dynamic range, get wide bandwidth speakers, multi-sub, and then move on to doing an immersive setup.
Right, exactly. So we can go ahead and skip on to the next slide. I think we covered this pretty well. But so, I think a lot of people, I wrote this slide thinking, well, I think you wrote this slide actually, but it was the point of this slide was exactly what we were hearing people say. It's like, but my Atmos system is awesome. It is awesome when it's done right. And we know a lot of people watching this video do have awesome systems that sound great. You're not who we're talking about when we've been making these claims.
We're talking about the audio industry as a whole, not the 10%, the upper 10% who are like I said, hardcore enthusiasts. And I think that if you put people, I think one more point I want to make is, if you put people, take a system of equal cost, right, and just give people like a 2-channel system versus equivalently costed 13-channel system or something, like 11-channel system like that, but have 2 really good speakers, but 13 so-so speakers and the sub that you could get for the cost of that system. I think that if you had people if you gave them a blind test between the sound of those 2 systems, the 2-channel system, assuming it's well engineered, would just almost everyone would prefer the sound of that. It would just sound so much more realistic. It might not have sounds behind you and above you, but the sound in front of you, which is the sound that matters by far the most, it's gonna be so much more convincing, it's gonna be so much more realistic and accurate, So
Uh-oh, that flies in the face of what Matthew's been saying. We always want at least 5.1.
no,
Well,
I'm just saying, I'm just making a point. Good 2 will blow away mediocre 13 or 11 or every day of the week.
And less is more.
Yeah, and when we were preparing for this, I was trying to bait you guys a little bit with a discussion about, what would be the point of diminishing returns? Because I think a lot of our viewers probably would want a number, right? So what's the dollar amount you got to spend on speakers before any more doesn't matter that much? And I think we were struggling to come up with a number.
It's too complex of
it is.
You can't tie that down because it depends on the size of the room, your listening habits. There's so many factors.
Too many different factors.
Yeah. But the point being, there probably is some number like that for a given room and somebody's needs, and I don't know exactly what it is. But I think for a lot of people's budgets, most people are spending probably less than $10,000 on their systems, and what that does do inevitably is compromise the speakers. I think there are some good $300-400 each speakers for sure, but I happen to think that some of the ones that are more like $1,000+ are like not a little better. They're like a lot better. I know you don't fully agree, but I happen to think they're a lot better. So to me, if your budget is $10,000 and you can buy, like 5, let's say $1,000 speakers, some good subs and a good receiver, that's a much better system than a 13-channel system spread out over that same budget.
I would definitely agree with that. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, with tiny little speakers all around you. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think that tends to be the issue. So that was the point we were making. All right. And then in terms of the quality issues we're talking about, Atmos really doesn't make sense in low cost systems. It ends up just sort of adding cost. And when we say low cost, some people were mentioning like those sound bars that have it, it's not really making a big improvement in those, I don't think. I've actually got, at this point, I have 3 of them in my house that we've been doing some testing with. And I watched the Super Bowl actually on one of the Sony sound bars with Atmos, and I watched the halftime game, and I was saying to James, it was like compressing the I gotta use a proper word since we're live. It was compressing quite a bit, the halftime show.
I didn't pay attention to the music. I just saw booties dancing all over the place.
You did like the shaking? Yeah, Shakira.
Shakira, I mean, when I look at Shakira, I'm not really listening at that point. But that's,
I hear you.
That's beyond this.
Well, apparently there's something wrong with me. I was listening, and I was noticing that the sound wasn't great, and I was mentioning to James that I've watched a couple movies on it, Blu-rays, and I also kind of had noticed that when the movies got loud and dynamic, the sound bar was not having it. It just wasn't keeping up. And I've never found that the surround effects really added much. The Vizio ones that we've used are better because they actually have discrete surround speakers, but they still don't tend to match what you get from a good system. So what's really missing? We've got this diagram of a spinorama chart for speakers, and it's getting that frequency response right that's really critical. And a lot of these speakers really don't. I actually, unfortunately, think that while speakers today are much better than they used to be, that still there aren't that many speakers that measure, for instance, as good as this one does or better.
Do you remember what speaker that is? I'm curious.
He knows, I'm sure. I don't remember exactly which one that was.
Something you measured, right, James?
Yeah, that's the BMR Philharmonitor.
Yeah.
Sadly, Philharmonic is not in business any longer, but you can get these speakers from Salk Sound.
Yeah, they're still a good deal.
I put these speakers, I put this chart up as an example of what you should be going for before you go for an expanded Atmos system. Get this right? If you can, once you get this right, and the core things that I mentioned here, which is that shows you a very linear response, get a really good dynamic range, or as much as have the speakers get as loud as cleanly as you want, and then get extended bass, that satisfies some people want 20 hertz, some people want 15 hertz, whatever. But once you get those things right, then go for those will play a bigger role in your in the quality of the sound than putting speakers above you.
Yeah.
But of course, that like I said, that's a subjective. That's for me.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people, if they had the same if they were blinded and were experienced the same systems, like I said before, right? They're going to go for a system that's going to sound more realistic than mediocre speakers, but more of them, So
Yeah.
And guys, when you look at our reviews, most of our, at least for the last couple of years, most of our loudspeaker reviews have these kind of charts, so you can see how the speakers perform objectively, and that helps you make a more informed purchasing decision before you go out and get them.
Yeah, and I think our point is been made repeatedly, which is that we want people to focus on quality. All right, so then in missed opportunities. So I think that there's a number of missed opportunities. Some of it is that there's a rich body of research that's been done looking at essentially how we perceive sound from coming all around us in what's called the azimuth, this direction like this, the medial vertical direction like this. And we've gotten a good sense of what the resolution, if you will, of our ability to detect sound objects in each of these directions and how to recreate it through a lot of speakers. And it didn't really seem to distill itself down when Atmos came out. I think we're making Gene fall asleep with our
Sorry.
teasing. So there, there's some research that suggests that it's very likely that this dispersion of a speaker is critical to the accuracy of our perceptions of this immersion of the object placement and everything. And there's just no guidance. Like THX had done some stuff in the early days to try to guide how speakers should be designed, and I think we're at that point again. And that's something that Dolby could have done, but they really didn't. And
well, they wouldn't have made any money.
Well, they could have charged for it. I wouldn't have cared. I just meant
no, but that's like peer research, on like how to find the best dispersion properties of a speaker, right? But once that's out there, you can't profit off anymore, right? That's why THX guards their well, one of the reasons why THX guards the specs that you have to meet in order to obtain THX certification. So like, I mean, they've done some of the research on this, and they don't, they keep it secret, because then if you knew what it was, then you could say, oh, this is a THX speaker. It just doesn't have THX certification.
Lots of people say that, but I know what you're saying. Yes, the actual specs are pretty tough.
And I question how much research Dolby actually put into this, because if you look at the Atmos enabled, the bouncy house speakers, there's so much variety of how companies are making them. There's one that has 4 drivers with no waveguide on it. Then there's some that have a waveguide on the tweeter. Then there's some that are concentric drivers. The dispersion characteristics of those different types of speakers is pretty drastically different, yet they somehow all have the Dolby logo on them. And it's all because they have that 9 or 8 element crossover with the head related transfer function. I think it has a lot less to do with the actual dispersion characteristics and more about just licensing that crossover.
Yeah, that makes sense. So something else I wanted to make a point of here too is that there's research into a kind of technology. It's related to the ambisonics research that I was mentioning earlier, and that's called ambiphonics. And this is a technology that uses crosstalk cancellation, kind of like the Polk speakers that I'm reviewing right now.
Yeah, the L800s.
The L800s, where 2 speakers are placed very close together. The signal is processed to cancel crosstalk, and these speakers, which are, I mean, they're really close together. They're 8 degrees apart or less, which means basically right next to each other, actually creates in front of you a sound image that is essentially as wide as the wall. It goes from one end of the room to the other. It's very impressive when it works right. And you can actually do full surround systems with this technology too. So is this what we should be doing across the board? No, I was mentioning to James earlier, when I've played around with it, it only works really for 1 or 2 people. Once you start to get a bunch of people in a larger room, it doesn't sound as good. But for sound bars, which already don't produce the most immersive the most immersive surround mix, there's something to be said for using technologies like this, for which there's been a lot of academic research and very little consumer acceptance. And there is some ambiphonic systems used in sound bars, but I've never seen one that took full on use of like the pan-ambio or per-ambio technologies, which allowed you to have essentially, you could have like 1 little speaker in the front and 1 little speaker in the back and actually get a full immersive surround mix from it the way it works. It's impressive.
Maybe something like that could be used as a side channel too, to give you better coverage.
Yeah.
Of
You
that
can.
area.
Yeah, that's actually part of how the technology can work. Now I see we have somebody who's, we've got a big highlighted comment here.
Okay, I can't see that because let me get out of the slides here. Stop screen share. Yes, we do right here. From Sam Hain.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to test those Pioneer Elite speakers. The ones, I mean, they have the bouncy speakers in them, but they had some interesting looking coaxial drivers that must have been like from, you know,
That's when Andrew Jones was there. Yeah.
Yeah,
but
was a good-
they developed these after he had left, and I wanted to see where they went with them after he had left. The Pioneer Elites, I don't think he was there for those. I don't think he was there.
I went to listen to that system at Best Buy, but they had drop ceilings, and I didn't hear the Atmos effect, and I think most of that just.
Oh, I don't even care about the Atmos effect. I just want to know how the speaker itself performs. But that's a speaker kind of had my eye for a while.
I've actually heard those a few times before, and it's one of the ones I've heard the Atmos bouncy house type effect on. I didn't think that the Atmos part of it worked all that well.
I wouldn't expect it to.
But the speakers themselves sounded fine. I think if I was to complain about anything, they're a little bit inefficient, which limits their dynamic range compared to the best I've heard.
I mean, that's a common characteristic with concentric drivers too. You give up some efficiency.
Yeah. So Erod lives, or he's upset that I'm suggesting he needs to buy Ambio speakers. I just want to make the point again. This is more of an academic product. Anybody can download the software to use it, but this is not don't worry. I'm not telling you to buy speakers. This thing does not exist on the market. You can't go out and buy it.
Yeah, again, guys, we're Atmos fans. We're just saying we don't want to liquidate the brand, kind of like what happened with THX, because nobody really takes THX seriously anymore, which is sad because when THX came out, they really did some pioneering work.
They did.
Yeah. You know, when we're going back to lost opportunities for an object-oriented sound mix, I think one thing that could have been done was that, okay, so in your standard like Atmos systems, there could be 5.1.2, 7.1.4, and so on. Well, in an object-oriented system, the speakers are just more objects. They're a different type of object, but one thing that I think what might have been pretty cool is if you had like a triple microphone setup that could triangulate the speakers of the speakers' positions, and so that the speakers can make a proper sound wherever you put them. You know, because they're just reproducing what the sound objects are, and so like you didn't need to have fixed placements with an object-oriented sound format, as long as the processor understood where the speakers actually were. And so like that's kind of and that would help like people who had like, you know, not everybody can put like 5 or 7 speakers in the exact places that it's supposed to go per like Dolby or DTS's recommended placement specs, you know. And so you could have that could have helped like subpar like surround speaker placements, you know, to have like a more proper type of sound coming from them and an object-oriented sound field. And like that never happened. That we just got fixed speakers instead of.
Well, Yamaha's YPow is supposed to do that with that little boomerang, and I've tested it a couple of times, and it puts something into the processor that maps the 3D coordinates for each speaker.
Chernoff too, yeah.
I didn't hear the effect that Yamaha claims it has when I tested it.
I wouldn't the effect that I would expect. I mean, I don't know how Yamaha really did it or how well it's done, but the effect that I would assume it would like, let's say your side surround left speaker has to be quite a bit closer to you than your side surround right speaker, right? Well, it should be able to like automatically compensate for you, or compensate in different heights if they can't be on a you know, perfectly even level with you. It can compensate for different heights of speakers, or that it can just like it knows how to put like the proper sounds for that coordinate in space in your room. And we didn't see that. That was kind of disappointing when that happened, but oh well, you know, maybe in future generations of object-oriented sound formats, we can get something that does that.
Yep, there's always room to upgrade. Matt, I think your video feed is frozen again.
Give me a second, I'll fix it. I don't know what.
Oh, I think we lost them. Well, I think we're about ready to wrap this up. I hope you guys, it gave you some good insights into the pros and cons, or the failures and successes of Atmos. I think it's more successes than failures. I do think that the brand sometimes gets too liquidated, and that was basically the main theme of this topic tonight. So why don't you guys give us some comments down below? Tell us, are you implementing a Dolby Atmos system in your theater? What kind of speaker configuration are you doing? Has Atmos transformed your whole home theater into a wonderful experience? Has it really made a difference, or has it just been kind of a marginal upgrade? Don't forget about our Patreon channel at patreon.com/audioholics. You get to go in there if you become a patron member to ask us direct questions, to give us video topic suggestions. You get access to content that's not published on the Audioholics website. And I hope you guys enjoyed tonight. And until next time, my friends, keep listening